After the surprise success of Barbenheimer at the box office, it was always going to be tough for whoever came next. I mean, how exactly do you follow on from the two biggest films of the year? One a long, dry, intellectual historical biopic tackling a serious subject matter, the other a light-hearted, dumb, fun feminist comedy. The answer is by giving audiences something they've been sorely missing in recent times. A fun, cheesy $100 million action movie starring everyone's favourite bald tough bloke, Jason Statham, battling enormous prehistoric sharks in the depths of the ocean. That's how. Honestly, I think Meg 2 is exactly the kind of palate cleanser we all needed, putting cinema back on track by having it do exactly what it's supposed to do: entertain! And what better way to do that than with an adrenaline-fueled escapist thrill ride that knows exactly what audiences want from it, that isn't trying to push any ideological or political messaging. A movie that resembles the blockbusters of times gone by, that simply asks you to sit back and enjoy the spectacle of watching sunbathing beach dwellers get attacked by giant sea monsters. Now, I'm not going to pretend that Meg 2 The Trench is some kind of groundbreaking, timeless masterpiece that will be etched in cinematic history and be remembered long after it's gone, because it won't. It's just a simple, unassuming, fun time at the movies that you'll probably forget about 5 minutes after watching. But therein lies the key to its effectiveness, succeeding in providing a welcome relief from the divisive politics and worn-out franchises that plague modern-day Hollywood, allowing you to just switch off your brain and enjoy the ride. The main reason being that, just like the first film, Meg 2 is a 100% Chinese-controlled IP, but created by Hollywood filmmakers and intended for a global audience. And as the first film was a surprise success back in 2018, earning over $500 million around the world with a $130 million budget, it was inevitable that a sequel was going to be made. So here we are. As I was saying, watching this film feels strangely nostalgic, like we're back in the 90s again, and I'm fairly certain that's due to its Chinese funders. You see, the Communist Chinese Party holds strict guidelines for films it chooses to support, so filmmakers looking to maximize their success in China have to follow certain Chinese-approved requirements in order to get the blessing of the CCP's Central Propaganda Department. And yes, that's literally what they're called. And as they don't provide an explicit list of do's and don'ts, the filmmakers have to make educated guesses on what to include and what to avoid. And after watching Meg 2, it's fairly obvious that the CCP, unlike the rest of Hollywood, are not embracing the woke ideology, as there's not a trace of identity politics anywhere to be seen. The other intriguing thing I noticed is the amount of Chinese spoken throughout. If you didn't know the background details, you might find yourself asking, why are there so many scenes with subtitles in a cheesy Hollywood film about giant killer sea monsters? And cheesy it is, because in contrast to the first film, the sequel has an increased sense of self-awareness and embraces a far less realistic tone than its predecessor. And whilst the original movie was certainly tongue-in-cheek and had its fair share of sillier moments, you could tell that the filmmakers were at least aiming for a somewhat more realistic and grounded premise than what's presented this time around. To briefly recap the events of the first film, Jason Statham plays Jonas Taylor, an experienced deep-sea diver working for an ocean exploration company called Manor One in the Pacific Ocean that's conducting a rescue operation within the Mariana Trench, the deepest oceanic trench in the world, measuring a staggering 36,000 feet deep, before he catches glimpse of a megalodon, a 50-foot, 50-ton shark thought to have gone extinct anywhere between 3.6 and 23 million years ago. The Meg starts attacking the sub, but no one else aboard sees it, and in trying to save them from being destroyed, Jonas makes a snap decision to evacuate back to the surface, leaving behind 2 of his crew. He's then accused of needlessly causing their deaths, leading him to quit the business and become an alcoholic loner while living in Thailand. Then, when another submersible goes missing in the same area, his old boss seeks him out, recognizing that he alone possesses the necessary experience to mount a rescue operation, and the rest of the film plays out with Jonas and the crew tracking down the missing sub whilst contending with the Meg. But in Meg 2, that degree of realism is completely discarded, and only 2 of the crew members from the previous film have returned, with all of the older and more realistically depicted seamen being replaced with younger, more attractive actors who look like they'd be more at home walking a catwalk than manning a high-tech deep-sea diving operation. Jason Statham's character too has been Flanderized. Instead of just being an experienced deep-sea diver, he's now become an eco-friendly James Bond, shown to us in the film's intro, blowing open a hole from within a shipping container to reveal he's on board a ship that's dumping toxic waste into the ocean, taking on the role of an environmental vigilante and documenting evidence to bring the crew to justice. And just like Bond, when he's caught, he's got a gadget-based backup plan, which sees him dramatically jumping off the ship to be rescued by a plane that scoops him out of the sea. And what's more, he's not even doing all this because he's under orders or for financial gain, but driven solely by a newfound desire to protect the ocean, like a green Batman who's committed to defending the environment all by himself. And talking of things being more far-fetched this time around, there's a noticeable dearth of superhero-esque sci-fi technology in Meg 2, including exosuits that enable the characters to walk around the ocean depths like they're wearing Iron Man suits. In contrast to the first film, where the most advanced technology was limited to small submersible pods, the sequel presents an array of futuristic elements, including underwater layers and high-tech gadgets, bringing a larger-than-life dimension to the proceedings, but undoing the more realistic tone set in the first film. And whilst the original film certainly wasn't striving for total realism, we are talking about 50-foot giant prehistoric sharks after all, it still made more of an attempt to ground its over-the-top concept. The crew's appearance, locations, sets, and the slow-burning plot all contributed to a more believable atmosphere, taking its time to build things up and gradually leading to the Megalodon. But Meg 2 abandons all pretenses of believability right from its opening frame, beginning with a flashback scene set 65 million years ago, where a T-Rex ventures too far into the ocean and is suddenly devoured by an awaiting Megalodon. This over-the-top opening sets the tone for a sequel that fully embraces its fantastical and larger-than-life elements, leaving behind any semblance of plausibility to make way for the crowd-pleasing spectacle it knows audiences want to see. And unlike the first film, which focused solely on the threat of a single Megalodon, the sequel rams up the excitement by introducing 3 of the buggers, along with amphibious snapping lizards, a giant octopus, gun-toting mercenaries, double-crossing infiltrators, and moustache-twirling villains, operating from James Bond-esque secret villain layers. And if you think combining all these elements together sounds chaotic and overwhelming compared to the simplicity of the first film, then you'd be dead right, as it's obvious that the filmmakers were aware that repeating the same formula just wouldn't cut it, so they've gone above and beyond to avoid any sense of monotony by cluttering the plot with as many threats and action set pieces as they can jam in a desperate attempt to avoid retreading the same ground. After the prehistoric flashback and the James Bond intro, we're then introduced to the new owner of Manor 1, Jiu Ming Zhang, who's inherited the company from his father, who we saw killed off during the first film. But surprisingly, his sister Su Yin, who played Jason's romantic interest in the original film, has been killed off between films, with no reason given for her death. And after doing some research, I discovered the actress was listed as part of the film's cast as late as February 2022. So clearly she bailed at the last minute, and with what must have been a hasty rewrite, China's most renowned action star, Wu Jing, was brought in to replace her at the last minute. But what makes this change of cast slightly disconcerting is that the daughter of Su Yin, Mei Ying, the little girl from the first film, is back, creating a slightly unusual unusual dynamic between her and Jason Statham's character, who has since become her legal guardian. But without the mother's presence, it unintentionally creates a curious atmosphere, as there's quite a few scenes featuring intimate gestures between Jason and the girl, such as kissing, embracing, and expressing their love to one another. But considering Jason is not her biological father, and the mother, who played the romantic interest, has been omitted from the film, these moments without her just feel a bit weird, and one has to wonder why her uncle didn't assume Mei Ying's guardianship, being a blood relative, instead of an Englishman who doesn't appear to speak any Chinese, and is the kind of bloke who spends his free time sealing himself inside shipping containers. And before I move on, it's also rather unfortunate that this young girl has experienced the loss of her father, grandfather, and mother, all in seemingly unrelated incidents. What bloody bad luck! Anyway, after we're introduced to the uncle, it's revealed Manor 1 now have a captured baby megalodon that's being kept in isolation in a reserve in Hainan, and the uncle is attempting to train it by getting into its tank to play with it. Yes, good luck with that, sir. And before we have time to make sense of all this, the film swiftly dives headfirst into an apparently routine underwater exploration back into the trench. It's interesting to note that in the first film, there was a long build-up of getting Jason's character to the rig, having him explore the place, and getting to know the crew and seeing the tech they have to work with. But Meg 2 skips all that and gets us straight back down with the subs, and this time, Mei Ying has hidden on board to come along for the adventure. Now, without getting into spoilers, something obviously goes wrong, and we crack on with some pretty fun and intense underwater action scenes, which comprises the first half of the film, with the second half featuring swarms of gun-toting mercenaries above water back on the rig, while the final act takes place at a beach resort filled with hapless sunbathers, literally called Fun Island. And this is what we're all really here to see: giant sea monsters and dinosaur stand-ins attacking crowds of innocent holidaymakers, where we get to see Jason Statham literally jumping the shark while jousting one of the Megs on a jet ski. The only problem is, it's too little too late, as we only reach Fun Island in the last 30 minutes of the 2-hour runtime, when surely this is the main attraction that audiences came here to see. Now, while I was entertained with Meg 2, it's pretty obvious that the film doesn't quite know what to focus on. All the plot elements feel disconnected from each other, with multiple disparate events happening simultaneously, making it feel like a smorgasbord of events, as if the filmmakers couldn't quite decide which plot thread was the most interesting, so they decided, fuck it, let's just do all of them, hoping that will be enough to keep audiences distracted from noticing the chaotic story. But the end result is a mishmash of random elements that lacks focus, and whilst the first film may have suffered from a slightly too slow a pace, it at least maintained its central focus by only having one threat in the form of a single Meg. So is Meg 2 The Trench worth seeing? Sure! If you're just looking for some escapist, cheesy sci-fi action and have 2 hours to kill, then you could do far worse. But don't get your hopes up and think you're going to see a Jaws or Jurassic Park, 2 films it tries to emulate, because it's not. But it's also not quite as silly as something like Sharknado. And I was just happy to see a big-budget action movie that isn't a superhero film or another tired franchise that's been played out to death, that doesn't take itself too seriously, doesn't try to push any identity politics, that simply allowed me to enjoy it for what it was, providing a breath of fresh air that put me in mind of the summer blockbusters of old.